Good morning and welcome to today's webinar. We appreciate you joining us. My name is Isabella Perry and I'm going to be your moderator. This presentation will be discussing updates to the 9104, 9101, and 9100 standard revisions, presented by Kim Wagner, our Aerospace Program Manager. A quick few housekeeping things. There will be a Q&A at the end. So if you have any questions for our presenter, please use the question portion of the Teams control panel. The slides and the recording will be available on our website after this presentation. Any additional questions, please contact us through our website for more information. Now, Kim will take it away discussing today's topic.
Thank you, Isabella. Welcome, everyone. Thank you so much for joining. We've got quite a lot to get through today. As Isabella mentioned, oops, one moment. There we go. My name is Kim Wagner. I'm the Aerospace Program Manager here at PJR. I'm also a certified aerospace auditor, or AA, for 9100, 9110, and 9120. I've been with PJR for over 10 years now. I've listed my email address here. Please feel free to take note of it. You can reach out with any questions on the topics we discussed today if you don't think of anything by the end of the presentation, or just any general questions about aerospace certification as they come up. As Isabella mentioned, please feel free to write questions in the Q&A section, and we'll get to those at the end of the presentation. All right, so to start, I just wanted to kind of give an overview of these standards that we're going to be talking about. There's a lot of different standards here, so I wanted to kind of clarify what each of them are for. All of these listed standards will be released at the same time. They're all under revision right now and in the final stages. So they will be released as a block of standards that we will transition to. There's going to be one block of training that our aerospace auditors will need to take for all these standards. I do have a note at the bottom that I want to bring up. All the AS standards will be renamed IA. It doesn't mean that they are completely new standards. The naming is just changing. And the reason for that is to align all of the regions, the Americas, Europe, and Asia Pacific, so that everyone is using the same terminology. Because currently there's slightly different naming of the standards for the different regions. Okay, so the first standard is the IA 9104/1. This is moving to Rev A, as all of the 9104 standards are. This first one is going to have probably the biggest impact on certified organizations. So we'll be talking about that one quite a lot today. And this standard is for requirements for aviation, space, and defense quality management systems. It includes a lot of requirements for certification bodies like PJR, requirements that we need to follow. It includes some requirements for certified organizations. It includes requirements for accreditation bodies and other bodies that are involved in aerospace certification. The 9104/2, this is requirements for the oversight of aerospace quality management systems and registration/certification programs. So this includes a lot of requirements for our oversight bodies, our accreditation bodies, and those other bodies that are involved in the oversight of the certification programs. Next is the 9104/3. These are requirements for aviation, space, and defense auditor training, development, competence, and authentication. So this standard includes requirements that folks need to meet in order to become aerospace auditors, the work experience requirements, the QMS auditing requirements, and how to maintain their certification. It also includes requirements for auditor authentication bodies and training bodies. The next one is the 9101. We're currently auditing to 9101F. It'll be going to Rev G in the new revision. These are requirements for conducting audits of aviation, space, and defense quality management systems. This tells auditors how they need to pre-plan for their audits, what they need to see on stage 1s and stage 2s and surveillance and research and special audits. It talks about how they need to complete their reporting. So these are where we get the form requirements that end up being part of your audit report in OASIS V3. Then lastly, we have the 9100, 9110, and 9120. These are all undergoing limited scope revisions that will be released along with the rest of the standards. So I will talk about that in just a moment, because I'm sure folks are probably curious about that one. All right, so just to give some background on the transition, I know everyone has been hearing about the transition for quite some time now, for several years now. So wanted to give a little background here. So back in 2022, the IAQG, the International Aerospace Quality Group, suspended the 9104 and the 9101 transitions. And the reasoning for this was that they wanted to realign all the certification scheme standards, the Delta training, and OASIS V3 on a coordinated timeline. So back at this time, PJR and other certification bodies had already started to implement some of these changes that we needed to and prepare for the transition. So that has all been on hold since this time. And since then, progress has been a bit slow. And we're told this is mostly due to translation. The IAQG had made the decision that they wanted to translate all the standards into all the needed languages before starting the transition again. And that was taking a lot longer than anticipated. They explained it that if you think about, we have one word in English, and that word, it's not always easy to find the correct word to translate it to in another language. And they have to do that for several languages. So it's just taking a lot longer. But they recently found a new translation provider and are a lot more encouraged. I believe they're now in the validation stage where they're validating everything that has been translated. So they're a lot more encouraged about the progress here. Now, as of October, this is what we have been told. Now, all of this is not set in stone. It's sort of just an estimate based on the information they now have. But currently, the IAQG is now hoping that the final revisions of these standards will be released March 1st, 2026. And once those standards are released, certification bodies will have a period of time to transition. So that time will be for implementing the changes, preparing their systems, and then reaching out to their accreditation bodies for their accreditation bodies to transition them, to approve that transition. But the specific timeline for all of that has not yet been decided. It will likely be between 8 and 13 months. They had originally told us 13 months, but there's been a little bit of pushback from stakeholders to shorten that timeline. They believe that because these revisions have been out since 2022, certification bodies should be ready. But there have been some additional changes since then. So there's still some work to be done. And accreditation bodies also need to assess all certification body systems. So they'd like some more time too. So we don't know the timeline yet, but as soon as we know, we'll be making sure to update everyone on that. But whatever that timeline is, at the end of that transition period, all certification bodies will transition at the same time. So no certification body is going to be starting audits to the new standards before the others. It'll all be at the same time. And after that point, all aerospace audits will be to the new standards. There will be a supplemental Rule 005 that'll have more details on the requirements and the timeline for the transition. So as soon as that's released, we'll be sure to share that with everyone and make sure we're all on the same page. Okay, so I wanted to get into the IA 9100, 9110, and 9120 limited scope revision. So all three of these aerospace standards are undergoing what they're referring to as a limited scope revision. The reason they're doing this is because the stakeholders are unhappy that the standard has not been revised in 10 years when so much has changed in the industry in 10 years. If you think about even the past 5 years since 2020, a lot has changed. And the current revisions of the standards that we're auditing to and certifying to are 2016. The prior year revision was 2009. So there was a 7-year gap between those full revisions. And now we're almost in 2026, and the full revisions of the standards are not estimated to be released until 2027. So that's about 11 years between the full revisions of the standards. So that's why the stakeholders pushed for this limited scope revision, as they're calling it. There's going to be about 8 changes overall to each standard, so it is limited. And all those changes will be related to supplier control. So there's going to be some few changes in Section 8.4, I believe also a change in Section 5 and Section 10. And this change will require certificate issuance to our certified organizations. So our certified 9100, 9110, 9120 organizations will get a new certificate after that transition. And as soon as we have more information, we'll be sure to share that with you all. As soon as we have those revisions of the standards when they're released, we'll have another webinar to talk through those changes and talk about what will be expected of organizations to implement those changes at their upcoming audits. Now, while all of this is going on, there are also other revisions taking place that have an effect on certified organizations. So for one, ISO 9001 is currently under revision. They're looking for that to be released between July and September 2026. But again, that is just an estimate. Some folks think it'll take a bit longer, but that is just what we were told most recently. And of course, the full revisions of the 9100, 9110, and 9120 are in process. They are tied to the ISO 9001 revision. And those are planned to be released in 2027. I believe they said this is the first time in history that they're working on two different revisions to the standards at once, the limited scope and the full revision. So it is an interesting time to be in the industry. Now, with the full revisions, there will likely be a 3-year transition timeline. So if you were involved during the 2016 transition, if you remember, there was a 3-year transition timeline. So that's likely what we will see for the full revisions. But again, it is still a bit early when we're talking about the full revisions. As soon as we have more details, we'll be sure to share that with you all. Okay. So let's get into some of the actual changes that are going to affect your organization. We're going to be talking about 4 main areas of the 9104 changes, including new requirements for aerospace certified organizations, the future of remote auditing, new documentation submission requirements, and new audit duration calculations. So to start, we'll talk about clause 85133 from 9104/1, which says the AQMS standards, i.e. 9100, 9110, or 9120, utilized for certification shall be selected based on the organization's scope of certification. And there's a note in the standard that says refer to the intended application of the AQMS standards to determine the selection of the appropriate standard. So what does that mean? This means that the scope of your organization, the scope statement that's listed on your certificate, must match with the standard to which your organization is certified to. So for example, if your organization is a distributor, technically the standard you should be certified to is 9120, which is tailored for distributors. However, we do have some organizations where the intended application doesn't quite line up with the scope. Since in the current revision of 9104, there's not a clear requirement for this. So during the transition, PJR will be reviewing all the scopes of our clients and will inform your organization if a change is required. So for example, if you are a distributor and you're currently certified to 9100, we will likely need to transition you to 9120. Now, there are some cases where your customers may require you to be 9100 certified. So if that is the case, what will likely happen is that we will add on 9120 rather than transition you to 9120. And the reason they're pushing for this is because, the 9120 standard, it's tailored for distributors. There are important requirements that the industries want distributors to meet, such as counterfeit parts prevention and suspect counterfeit parts prevention requirements that aren't quite in 9100 or as detailed in 9100. And in 9120 has very specific requirements for MRO organizations. And so if you're just certified 9100, you are missing some requirements that the industry deems really important for MRO organizations in 9110. So that's sort of the reasoning behind this. Again, if we do find that your organization needs a change, we will communicate that to you as soon as possible and come up with a plan to make that transition as smooth as possible. Okay, so just to go through the intended applications of these standards, so you're aware, 9100 has the biggest umbrella. Most organizations fall under the intended application of 9100. This is for organizations that design, develop, or provide aviation, space, and defense products and services, and by organizations providing post-delivery activities, including the provision of maintenance spare parts or materials for their own products and services. Now, 9110 is for organizations whose primary business is providing maintenance or continuing airworthiness management services for civil or military aviation articles and products, and by OEMs with maintenance, repair, and overhaul operations that are operated autonomously or that are substantially different from their production operations. And finally, 9120 is for organizations that procure parts, materials, and assemblies and resell these products to a customer in the aviation, space, and defense industries. So those are the intended applications. That's what we'll be using to determine if your organization's scope is aligned with the correct standard. Okay, now this leads us to 8521B of 9104, which says for an IMS, meaning Integrated Management System, with fully integrated AQMS standards, certification bodies shall calculate the audit duration for each standard individually, then take the standard with the highest amount of audit duration and add 50% of the audit duration for each additional standard. So for example, if your organization has integrated all three aerospace standards, we need to calculate the audit duration by first starting with the 9100 audit duration, then adding 50% of the 9110 and 50% of the 9120. So this has changed quite a bit from the current requirements for determining audit duration for integrated systems, which currently requires 15% for each integrated standard if fully integrated. So I know that sounds like a lot, but the 9104 standard does have the opportunity for reductions, which I will talk about later on. Currently, reductions, I believe, are only allowable for several site schemes, but in the new version of the standard, there are possibilities for reductions for all schemes. So I will talk about that in later on when we talk about the audit duration, the new requirements for audit duration calculation. Okay, the next requirement I wanted to talk about is 8.5.11.1, which says CB's certification bodies shall suspend certification and retain documented information supporting the suspension decision for any of the following conditions. A, when an organization fails to reestablish conformance within 90 days from the date the nonconformance was issued, or B, when an ethical complaint, e.g. code of conduct or ethical related nonconformity, has been substantiated with supporting objective evidence. So in the new version of the standard, they require suspension in these two different scenarios. And so we'll talk about each scenario a little bit, starting with scenario A. So what does this mean? This means that when a nonconformance is issued, the organization must, 1, provide immediate correction for the nonconforming condition, 2, identify the root cause of the nonconformity, 3, identify and implement corrective actions required to address the root cause and return the process to conformance, and then 4, implement any other actions to ensure that the condition does not repeat. Now, sometimes step 4 takes a bit longer. That could be over an extended amount of time, and that's okay. The reestablishment of conformance to your process would be at step 3. So steps 1 through 3, that's what we need to be completed within 90 days of the date that the nonconformance was issued. Verification of the effectiveness and closure of the nonconformity occurs after step 4 and can take longer than 90 days. Now, so if steps 1 through 3 are not completed within 90 days, then PJR is required to suspend the organization. But the current requirement in the current revision of 9104 is 60 days. So this actually gives your organization a bit more time, which is helpful overall because I believe that in certain situations, it does take a bit longer to really dig deep in your system and effectively identify the root cause and the true corrective action to prevent these issues from recurring. So in the new version of the standard, you will get a little bit more time for nonconformance responses, at least in terms of the implementation. Now, for an example, let's say an organization was issued a nonconformance because their management review meeting missed some of the required inputs from 932 of the standards. So with that being said, the organization then has 90 days to either complete a new management review, including the missing inputs, or conduct a gap review to cover those missing inputs. That's the correction, right? That's what addresses the specific objective evidence that the auditor found. Then they discover the root cause that led to the missing inputs, what was lacking in the process that led to this nonconformity. Then step 3 would be to identify and implement the actions to address that root cause and bring the process back into conformance. That's the corrective action. And so after these 3 steps, that's when the establishment of conformance is completed. Then you implement any other actions necessary to ensure the nonconformance does not repeat. So if steps 1 through 3 are completed within 90 days, that is what we're looking for. If we don't meet that 90-day deadline, then that's when we are required to suspend. Okay, so the second scenario that is mentioned in 8511.1 is related to ethical complaints. So if PJR is informed of an ethical complaint, we must first investigate. We could be informed of an ethical complaint via an OASIS feedback ticket, an anonymous complaint via our website, an email. There are multiple ways we could learn of a complaint. But once we do hear that complaint, we investigate, and that investigation could include requesting documentation, conducting interviews, conducting a special audit. And if the evidence that we obtain substantiates the complaint, then PJR is required to suspend. So an example of an ethical complaint could be if we're informed that an organization has shipped non-conforming product knowingly without proper disposition or informing of interested parties. If we were informed of that, we would have to investigate. And if we substantiated that claim with evidence, then we'd have to suspend the certificate. Now, before I get into this next requirement, I just want to clarify the difference between suspension and withdrawal of your certification. So if your certificate is suspended, it is possible to reinstate the certificate. So there's certain things that need to happen for us to do that. Whereas if your certificate is withdrawn, at that point, your organization would need to start over with the stage 1 and 2 audit in order to regain certification. So that's the difference there before I get into this next requirement. Now, 912 of 9104 says that AQMS certified organizations that have their AQMS standard certification suspended shall provide notification to their aviation, space, and defense customers within 15 days of suspension. So if your organization's certificate does get suspended, whether it's because of one of those two scenarios we went through, another reason, you're required in this new revision to notify your aerospace, space, and defense customers within 15 days of that suspension decision. There's also a note in the standard that says organizations should also provide notification when their certification is withdrawn. All right. Okay, so another one of the big changes in the new 9104/1 is that the standard no longer recognizes several site schemes or complex structures. Only single sites, multi-sites, and campus structures will be recognized. So I don't believe PJR has any organizations that are considered complex structures, but we do have some organizations that are several site schemes. So if your organization is not a single site, multi-site, or campus structure, we will be conducting a review of your organization and making a determination of which structure in the new standard is appropriate for your organization. So if we need additional information, we'll be reaching out to you to get that. And once we determine which structure your organization falls under, we'll be informing you of that. Now, I do want to note that in the original revision that was released in 2022, campus structures were also removed. And we have quite a bit of organizations that are campus structures. And so when the transition first began back in 2022, some certification bodies did transition their campus structures to multi-sites already. And now they're going to have to transfer them back because just in the past few months, they determined that they want to add campus structures back into the new 9104. Which I think is good news because if all campus structures were to transition to multi-sites, that would be an increase in audit days. And the industry just does not quite have the auditor base available to cover those mandates that would be required. Now, the 9104-3 revision does have there is the ability for AAs to transition to AEAs. So there is some work being done to increase the auditor base. But in the new revision of the standard, we do now have campuses back. So we'll have single sites, multi-sites, and campuses. And again, if your organization does not fall under one of those categories, we'll be working to find the right category for your organization. Okay, so let's talk about the future of remote auditing or virtual auditing next. So 8542 of 9104/1 says that where a physical location of a site exists, the ICT, meaning information and communication technology, is utilized, a maximum of 50% of the audit duration may be conducted remotely. So currently, we are only allowed to conduct 30% of your audit virtually or remotely. But the new revision of the standard gives us a little more time. It lets us do 50% of the audit duration remotely. So if you have an 8-day audit, we could potentially do 4 of those days virtually. which I think is good because there are some processes that can really be effectively audited remotely. So some design and development processes are conducted in a cloud environment, and so it makes it quite easy to audit that process virtually. Or sometimes support activities like management review, internal audit. If your organization keeps those records electronically, sometimes it makes sense to audit those virtually. So in the new revision of the standard, we will be able to conduct up to 50% of all audits remotely. Now, 8543 also says where a physical location of a site does not exist, i.e. a virtual site, reference IAF MD1, ICT shall be utilized in accordance with IAF MD4. Now, when I reference IAF documents, those are just some additional governing documents that certification bodies need to follow. So let's look at this a little bit more. What is a virtual site per IAF MD1? Now, this is going to be rare. Only a very small percentage of organizations are going to fall under the virtual site definition. It's really not going to be common. But a virtual location is where an organization performs work or provides a service using an online environment that allows persons from different physical locations to execute processes. A virtual site cannot be considered as such where the processes must be executed in a physical environment. So for example, if your organization does warehousing, physical testing, if you're a physical testing laboratory, if you do installation or repairs to physical products, if you're at any point handling the product physically or need to execute your process in a physical environment, you would not qualify as a virtual site. But an example of a virtual site would be a design and development organization where all employees perform work remotely. They're working in a cloud environment. They never need to physically handle the product. It's just design and development. They don't do any manufacturing or anything like that. That could qualify as a virtual site. Now, a virtual site would be considered a single site for the purposes of calculating audit time. So folks may be working all across the country remotely, but we would still consider them a virtual site if they meet the criteria here. Now, note 4 says for further information, see also IAF MD4, the use of information and communication technology for auditing and assessment purposes. So we'll talk a little bit about that here. What does IAF MD4 say must happen? So if you would like part of your audit to be virtual or all of your audit to be virtual, we do need you to complete a form to confirm your capabilities. Now, 100% virtual auditing will really not be possible in the new version of the standard for initial surveillance and recertification audits unless you qualify as a virtual site. But either way, even if just part of your audit is being virtual, we do need you to complete a form to confirm your capabilities and that you have the infrastructure to support a remote audit. Now, a lot of you have probably already completed this form, especially if you were certified with PJR through the COVID pandemic. We had a lot of audits going virtually during that time. And so basically this form just asks a series of questions to determine that if your organization is capable of supporting a virtual audit. So for instance, if you have Wi-Fi throughout your facility so that the auditor can see throughout your whole facility while auditing virtually. If you're familiar with virtual audit platforms like Teams or GoToMeeting or other platforms like that, if you're comfortable with the audit being streamed to the auditor throughout the whole facility. So we ask a series of those questions. And if we do determine that your organization is capable of having a virtual audit, PGR can set up the virtual meeting on GoToMeeting. We have some licenses that we can set that up for you. Or if your organization prefers a different platform such as Teams, we could possibly approve that. We're okay with Teams. We're okay with most platforms, but you just need to let us know which you would prefer. And if you do prefer something different from GoToMeeting, you would be responsible for coordinating with your auditor to set up that virtual audit. But regardless, audit duration would still be calculated the same as for a physical on-site audit. Now, in the same vein of remote auditing, there is a new requirement in 9104/1A that says, and this is in 8510.3, special audits shall be conducted on site for scope extensions or the addition of sites to an existing certification. But the note here says other types of special audits, for example, complaints, transfers, corrective actions, may be conducted remotely. So if your organization is adding a site, then we have to go on site for that special audit so the auditor can physically audit that new site. If your organization is adding on to your scope, so let's say you're adding passivation, for example, to your scope of certification, then our auditor will need to physically go on site to audit that process. But the new version of the standard does allow for other types of special audits to be conducted remotely, such as complaint investigations or special transfer audits or corrective action reviews or name change audits. So there's a little more flexibility with other types of special audits in the new version of the standard to be conducted remotely. Okay, so the next topic here are new documentation submission requirements. So this is going to be a pretty big change. Now in 9110 of 9104/1A, it says AQMS certified organizations shall provide data required by this standard to their certification body prior to initial surveillance and recertification audits for the completion of the OCAP analysis. And the note here says failure to provide accurate and timely data may result in the issuance of a nonconformity by the CB and or prevent certification. Now, the 9101 also has a similar requirement to support this process. It says it requires that organizations provide the OCAP data to the CB prior to initial surveillance and recertification audits. Now, PJR does currently have a pre-audit form that we sent out prior to, there's one specifically for before stage 1 audits, and we also have one that we send out to our clients before surveillance audits and recertification audits. And the purpose of this is to assist in the auditor's planning. Now, in the new revision of the standard, it'll be very important. It'll be imperative that we get this information from you, because if we do not have it, then we're not going to be able to determine your audit duration. And so as it says here, that may result in an issuance of a nonconformity. It may prevent your certification entirely. It may result in adding time to your audit is another possible way if we do not receive this information. So I'll be talking about this a little bit more, but just know it's going to be really important that we get this pre-audit data before the audit. And the reason for this is that CB's certification bodies must now complete an OCAP tool, which stands for Organization Certification Analysis Process. And this is to determine the audit duration. So we can schedule your audit prior to receiving this new required information, but once the information is received, the audit duration may change depending on that information. The information is also required to be verified once your auditor is on site during the audit. So because of that, we cannot have the information too far in advance of the audit. It needs to be up to date so that the auditor will be verifying it during their audit. So ideally, the information would be received approximately 3 to 4 months prior to your audit start date. That would be kind of the sweet spot there, where it's not too early, not too late. The auditor would be able to verify it and it would still be up to date. So what will happen is your scheduler will be sending the request for the information approximately 6 months prior to the audit. So then your organization has a little bit of time to prepare, gather this documentation, and have it ready for us about 3 to 4 months prior to your audit. And again, this is going to be the process once we transition. It's not our current process. So what information is required? We are required to review all this information to complete that OCAP tool. We need to see a copy of your interaction of processes. We need to see a copy of your internal audit program or procedure if you have an internal audit procedure. We need to see a copy of your latest internal audit reports and findings, a copy of your latest management review meeting, a copy of your on-time delivery goals and the actuals, your actual performance in on-time delivery, a copy of your conformity of delivered product or service goals and actuals, meaning your quality data. This could be scrap, this could be first pass yield, this could be returns, a copy of your customer satisfaction goals and actuals, a copy of your customer complaints and feedback, report cards if you've received any report cards from customers, that's what we'd be looking for there. A copy of product related safety issues if you have had any, if that's applicable. If not, that's great. Then we need you to confirm the number of sites, the number of employees, confirm your scope of certification, and then let us know of any other additional aerospace standards that you utilize, whether these are you're required to utilize these per a customer contract or you voluntarily use these. So examples would be the AS 9146, the fraud prevention program standard, or the AS 9102, the first article inspection requirements standard. So any other aerospace related standards that you use, we need to know about those as well. And this is all required by the new 9104/1. Okay, so next we're going to get into the audit time calculation. We have to take into account all that we just went over. But before that, I just wanted to clarify a couple of terms here. So when I refer to audit duration, that is the time from the opening meeting to the closing meeting. So that's the time your auditor is auditing. So it's the time from the opening meeting to closing meeting, just the auditing time. But the audit time includes the audit duration plus the offsite time. So the offsite time includes planning, report writing, includes the NCR management that happens after the audit. So audit time is overall onsite and offsite time. Audit duration is just the time spent auditing from the opening to closing meeting. Okay, so once we get all of the information that we just went over a couple slides ago, then we use that information to determine the risk level of your organization. And so this table you see here, this is embedded into that OCAP tool. And so we'll take a look at the information you give to us, and we'll first determine the complexity of your organization. There's a figure 2 in the 9104 standard that guides us to make that determination of whether you're low, medium, or high complexity. That's based on things such as the complexity of your scope, if it's just, machining of metal parts, or if there's quite a lot going on in your scope. If it's machining and heat treat and paint and design, then that would increase the complexity. We also look at the number of sites you have, the number of employees, and things like that to determine the complexity. We then take a look at your internal audit program and your internal audit reports, and we also have a table 5 in the standard that guides us to determine whether it's low, medium, or high risk. This looks at things like the frequency of your internal audit, the resources available for your internal audit, other factors there that we use to determine the risk level of your internal audit. Then we look at your on-time delivery information, your conformity or quality information, customer complaints and feedback. We see if you're meeting your expectations, exceeding them, or if you're below them. Then we determine that. And then lastly, we also have to take a look at your previous audit report and look at the lowest value of the pair. And so the pair is the process effectiveness assessment report. And so if you've been audited before, if you've looked at your OASIS report, you'll see that for some process of your organization, the auditor is required to create a pair report. And so let's say, for example, your organization has 4 processes: management, contract review, purchasing, and production. For contract review, purchasing, and production, those processes would require a pair because they likely touch on Section 8 clauses. And so the auditor would complete a pair for each of those processes and would then determine a pair score. And that pair score is based on the number of nonconformities. So if you do have a nonconformity, let's say in your purchasing process, that would bring you down to a 4. Let's say that you've also missed one of your KPIs, or your key performance indicators that you've assigned to purchasing to measure the effectiveness of purchasing. If you miss one of those KPIs, but you're taking action, that would bring you to a 3. Let's say you're missing a KPI and not taking action, that would bring you to a 2. So that's just sort of a quick summary of how the pair scoring works. And we need to look at your previous audit reports pairs to get that last criteria there. So then within the OCAP tool, we put all this information in, and there's a formula that then determines the overall risk level of your organization. Okay, so once we get the OCAP information, we determine the risk level, then we need to start with the base audit duration. And that is based off of your employee count, which is how it currently is as well in the current version of 9104 that we're working to. So let's say your organization has 115 employees. So we would look at the 101 to 125 bracket here. Let's say you have a surveillance audit. So then we would go to this middle column here. So our starting point would be 3.5 days. So we'll look at your employee count and the type of audit, and that's how we get your base audit duration. Now, if your organization is a campus scheme, we take a look at the overall employee count for all sites. So let's say you have 3 sites, they each have 5 employees. We'd be looking at 15, which falls into the 11-15 bracket. And so your overall audit duration, would be 1.5. If you're a multi-site, we calculate it per site. So if each site has 5 employees, you're a multi-site, we look at this 1 to 5 bracket, it would be 1 day for each site. Okay, So once we have the base audit duration determined and your risk level, we would either give you a 10% reduction if you're low risk. We would not change the time if you're medium risk. We would give a 10%, we would be required to give a 10% addition if you're high risk. So that's why it's really important that we get that information, that information we need to do the OCAP analysis, so that we're giving you the correct audit duration adjustments. Okay. I previously mentioned that there's also going to be some allowable site audit duration reductions. So we would review the site-specific processes, and that could potentially result in a reduction to a site's audit duration. So for example, if your organization doesn't do design, if you're not design responsible, designs are provided by your customers and you're just billing to print, you get a 20% reduction. Now, let's say you have a multi-site organization and just the headquarters is responsible for the management of the QMS and the control of externally provided processes, products, and services, aka purchasing. So only headquarters does management and purchasing, and the other two sites just do design and production. So because of that, we could give you a 25% reduction for those two sites because they're not doing any management or purchasing activities. So it's really important that your interaction of processes document really clearly identify what processes occur at each site, because we want to make sure we're getting you the most fair audit duration possible and give you reductions wherever possible. So if you currently have more than one site and your interaction of processes document doesn't really delineate what happens at each site, I would really recommend clarifying that before we transition so that it's a little bit easier and more clear for us so that we can give you the most accurate audit duration as possible. Okay. Now, with all of this, there's a couple other requirements I wanted to mention that are specifically related to audit time calculation. So 85165 says that the total reduction by site after all adjustments, including rounding, shall not exceed 50% of the audit duration. So we cannot give you more than 50% of a reduction at each site. That's just a requirement that we have to follow. Now, 85166 says to determine audit time, 20% shall be added to the total audit duration for all sites. This is added time to be used for the OCAP analysis, audit planning, and report writing. So we are required to add a minimum of 20% for off-site activities like completing the OCAP analysis, for audit planning, for report writing. This time is also used for non-conformity management. So the auditor has time to review your non-conformance responses if you do have any non-conformities and things like that. So that's a very specific requirement. Okay, so let's work through an example of how the audit duration will be calculated in the new standard. Again, this is all after we transition. These changes are not going to be implemented now. This is all after we transition, after that transition period, and all CBs are performing audits to the new standards. So in this example, we have an organization that has a recertification audit coming up. They have 66 employees, and the OCAP documentation showed that they're low risk and that design is not applicable. They did a great job getting all that information into us ahead of time, so we determined that they're low risk based on the information that they gave us. Okay, so let's go back to Table 8 to see where we get our base audit duration for 66 employees. Okay, so 66 would be in the 66 to 85 bracket. They have a recertification audit coming up. So our starting point is going to be 5.5. That's the base audit duration. So 5.5 audit days. Now, because they are low risk, they get a 10% reduction. Because design is not applicable, they get an additional 20% reduction for no design responsibility. So that gives us a total of a 30% reduction. 30% of 5.5 days is 1.65 days. So we subtract 1.65 from 5.5. That gives us 3.85. We are required to round to the nearest half day, which would bring us to 4.0. So then 4 days is going to be our audit duration. The auditor will need to spend 4 days auditing your organization, and that's 8 hours per calendar day. Now, in this new revision also, it says that we need to round to the nearest half day. In the current revision, we have to round up, but in this new revision, it gives us the possibility to round down. So let's say after our calculations, we ended up with 3.55. We could round down to 3.5, where currently we'd have to round up. So I think that's a bit more fair, right? Since we're a lot closer to 3.5 than we are to 4.0. Um, but again, in this situation, we've ended up with a 4.0 audit duration. We then have to add 20% for planning. So that brings us to an overall 4.8 audit time. 4 days on-site auditing, and then we got 0.8 days for the planning and report writing and nonconformity management. So that's just an example, again, of how the audit duration and audit time will be calculated in the new version of the standard after we transition. Okay, so this is all the information we currently have. As soon as we get more updates, we'll be sure to share that information. Like I said, once they actually release those standards, we can talk about the specific changes, especially in the limited scope revisions of the 9100 and 9110 and 9120 standards. As soon as we know what that transition timeline will be, as soon as the supplemental rule 005 is released, we'll be sure to share all this information with you. We're really dedicated to making sure we can have a smooth transition for all our certified organizations. Okay, so that is about it. So we can go ahead and see if there are any questions now. So if I'm looking at this correctly, I'm not seeing any current questions, but I'll give it a minute and see if anyone thinks of anything they'd like to ask. And of course, if you don't have any questions at this time, please feel free to make note of my email address. I have that right here. And feel free to reach out once you do think of any questions. It looks like someone has their hand raised. So let me see. You can go ahead. I believe I gave you the ability to unmute yourself. Or you can type it in the Q&A section. Looks like that's AE Basnet. If you want to go ahead, I think you should be able to unmute yourself now. Oh, I'm sorry, you said the 9102. So I'm currently not aware of revisions to the 9102. That is not one of the standards that PJR certifies to. But I can look into that and see if there's anything currently going on with that, if it's being revised. So let's see, I can look into that. And if you would like to shoot me an email, I will follow up with you on that. I don't want you to necessarily share your email here so that it's not everyone can see it, but please take note of my email and reach out to me via email and I'll look into that for you. Okay, we have a question from Kieran that says, when will the presentation be added to the website and where will it be stored? So Isabel, I may need to defer to you for that question. Isabella, excuse me.
You're good. So on our website, www.pjr.com, there will be a section in our webinars. Under training, there's a webinars tab. You just click that. We have our past webinars in there. You can also shoot us an email if it's not uploaded in time. If you want it sooner, we can try to get it to you as soon as we possibly can.
Thank you. Okay, and Ralph asks, so they will have to transition to the partial transition first within 8 months, then again to the full transition within 3 years. So there will be 2 transitions, Ralph, yes, but for our clients, they are not going to be having a transition within 8 months. That's a PJR requirement. So, or that's for PJR. So PJR is a certification body. We'll need to transition within 8 months. Then moving forward, those audits will, after that transition period, those audits will be to the new standards. Our clients will need to transition to the limited scope revisions. We don't have the timeline yet for that. But after that transition, then down the line, once the full revisions of the standards are released, then there will be a 3-year period that we think there'll be a 3-year period for them to transition to the full revisions of the standards. I know it's a bit confusing. I'm hoping that made sense.
And the slideshows, again, they'll be available on our website for free download. They'll go out hopefully this week. We'll have them uploaded, so just keep an eye on our website and you'll be able to download the slideshow from there.
Okay, and Kip asks, if we have to transition to a new standard, does that require a stage 1 and 2? So I'm guessing this means if you are, for instance, 9100, but you should be 9120, if you'll need a stage 1 and 2. And the answer is we don't believe so at this point. The last communication we got about this with that is that there would be a special audit rather than a full stage 1 and 2. So there'd be a special audit and then a stage 2 audit to cover all the delta requirements in the 9120 standard or whichever standard you have to transition to. So the audit time would not be as much as a full stage 1 and 2 audit. We would do about 40% of that audit time. And we believe that that would be enough time to cover all those additional requirements that you're not currently implementing there in the new standard. So it would be a special audit in a stage 2, and the time would be 40% of the time that is typically required for a stage 1 and 2 audit. Okay. Yeah, I'm not seeing any other questions, but again, please feel free to reach out to me. My email address is listed here. If you think of anything after today, we'll keep you guys updated. We definitely want to make this transition as smooth as possible. So any updates we get, we'll be sure to communicate that with you.